Welcome to Concerts from the Library of Congress. I am Claudia Morales, one of the producers, and I'm here with my colleague David Plyler to talk to members of Ensemble Del Niente, who will perform on our digital stage on November 13th. But before we do that, I want to invite you to learn more about our coming events. We have a fantastic season ahead of us, so please follow us on the social media and visit us at loc.gov/concerts. Now, described as a superb contemporary music collective by the New York Times, a model of what contemporary music needs but seldom gets by the Chicago Tribune, and an exuberant vitality and expressiveness by the New Yorker. Ensemble Del Niente performs new and experimental chamber music with dedication, virtuosity, and exploratory spirit. Now in its second decade, Ensemble Del Niente roster's 23 musicians has performed concerts across Europe and the Americas. I would like to introduce Executive Director and harpist Ben Melsky, conductor Michael Lewansky, vocal artist Carrie Shaw, violinist Minghuang Xu, and pianist Winston Choi. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to have you here virtually. We, of course, wish that we could be together in the same room and hope that that can happen again at some point in the not so distant future, as we all do, I know. But we are particularly excited about this program, which has been coming together for quite some time now. And I thought we could talk about the pieces on the program and just learn a bit about them and how you came to program these particular works and some interesting things that you've encountered as you've explored them. So one of the works is a new commission from the Library of Congress, the McKim Fund in the Library of Congress, by Igor Santos. And we had a really nice conversation with Igor on Friday, which will seem like immediate right now since we're in the video realm. I don't need to make these references to time in the same way that one does normally. I'll figure this out eventually. But and he gave us a very in-depth kind of discussion about what he was doing. But this new work that he composes called Confined Speak. And Winston and Minghuan, I'm wondering if you could both speak a bit about the process of learning a new piece in general in these kind of conditions, and then also what the approach has been to this particular work and how you've been interacting with Igor.
Well, I think that as you guys can see that we are in the same screen, so it's not too difficult for us to keep rehearsing because we're a husband and wife team. So we're able to keep working. I think the only thing is that we do have 8 years old twins, and they are currently also remote learning at home with us. So there's 4 of us constantly, and our piano is in the living room. So when we rehearse, our kids are around, and that's something that, that's what we do. It's our lifestyle. With Igor's piece, and I think this piece can really relate to what the current situation we're all in. Confined Speak, we also had a very in-depth conversation with him a couple of weeks ago. It's about the fact that we're all in the middle of pandemic and we're all still home. And there's certain times that we feel that our voice is being choked. And so we can't express ourselves freely. We can't meet with our friends. That's the way we used to. So we are very limited at this point still. So he uses this, he called it the boxed speech, where he recorded a lot of muffled and stuttery speech. And so it basically expresses the current situation we're all in. And I think that, just being confined, he was talking to us about when we're staying in for so long, sometimes it can get to us mentally too. So do you agree what he was talking to us about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's being longtime collaborators of Igor Santos, having played another work of his for violin and piano, and I've played numerous works of his for piano and large ensemble in a somewhat of a soloistic role, like a mini concerto, as well as some of his solo piano pieces for piano and synthesizers there, I should say. And so what strikes me about this that's so different is I think many of his other pieces have such a flow to them. It's very fluid writing and continuous, full of these gestures. And this, even though there are aspects of the writing which seem very familiar because it's his language and his style, but the fact that there is very little flow, things are broken up and disjointed, and that's so deliberate. And so it's a kind of reimagining in a way of his language, and often copying that aspect of stuttering, right, where you have sounds that come up before your brain can process what's coming out. So there's a lot of that kind of going on. So it's a very, we find a fascinating way of making music because we're not necessarily interacting with movement, but interacting with this disruption of free-flowing movement.
Were you able to have a decent amount of back and forth? Because I know that there's some components that are because of that muffling and the different types of muting and things like that go on, that it might be difficult if you're not in the same room to be able to, really explore that and say no, like this, or something like that. Were you able to deal with the technology that you have to be able to make that happen?
Yes, we had some meetings about it. I mean, Zoom meetings are really, it's very helpful. And we can, I showed him my options of mutes. And it's very often used in this piece because, again, it's that muffled speech feeling. So I'm using a very heavy metal mute. We often call it practice mute or hotel mute. It rarely, it barely make any sound. But very often that he actually writes with fortissimo, so the gesture is there. It's like basically, it's like how it feels like sometimes we're screaming in our dreams, that we try to scream but nothing comes out. That kind of feeling is that the gesture is actually very big. When I play, you will see that I'm really digging in, but there's barely any sound because of the mute.
Another thing that that we found very helpful is Igor is such a techie, and he prepared some videos. He filmed himself in video and sent it to us with very precise ways of doing some of the piano techniques. So specific sounds with using, for instance, a credit card inside the piano at certain angles, things like that, which are very helpful going into our first reading and recording when we're just recording ourselves to practice. It's very helpful to have such a specific kind of sound and also the means to create that sound.
That's fantastic. He shared the first 70% or so of the score, and one of my favorite parts were the pictograms of the hand holding a credit card, and in different orientations. It didn't specify which credit card, so I guess you had some flexibility depending on credit. But that's fantastic, and that's I love the idea of being able to demonstrate these things visually too. I'm sure that's got to be a very helpful scenario. So maybe that's a positive outcome that could keep going forward with this sort of situation.
Absolutely. Yes. We actually worked with him just last year. We premiered one of his pieces that was written for us from Foundation. And the piece was called As Light Becomes Form. It was actually inspired by one of Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings. It's called Unity Temple. We actually premiered that piece in the temple. And the piece was incredibly colorful, and it was inspired by lights. Since last year, and we've been somehow just have been working with him very frequently. And for this piece, even though there's certain language of his playing, his writing is very similar. For instance, he always writes for my instrument, violin, incredibly colorfully. And he often would explore different sounds from heavy mute to lighter mute and to sopant, very close to the bridge, or pizzicatos behind the bridge or on the bridge. So he really get maximum color of the instruments. And but as Winston said earlier, that this piece is, even though both pieces are from Igor and they're very different, the last piece, As Light Becomes Form, has much more flow and beauty. And this piece is just at places much more jarring, I would say. And in some ways, it's darker in colors, in characters. Yeah.
Can I jump in on something here, even though this is a piece that I'm not playing. One of the things that I wanted to just dovetail with all the things I had mentioned about Igor's music in particular, and Winston had mentioned playing a concerto of his several years ago with Del Niente, a big piece called Suggested Affinities. I myself just played a harp and percussion duet that he wrote for Del Niente not too long ago. And there is always this sense of the body in his music. And like in the title, for example, and there's a sense of like the sounds that you were making that are part of the piece are kind of the body of the instrument, kind of the corporeal nature of the instrument itself. And so it has a sense of being both highly technical, but also being really intuitive and natural where the sounds sort of come from. In Suggested Affinities, you know, he sort of amplifies and focuses the light on all of the extra sounds that the piano makes, like the sound of the pedal coming up or like the depression of the keys or something like that. And it just is this incredible way to approach the instrument. And in Anima, there's all these extra sounds between the harp and the percussion that are really outside sort of the normal range of like playing, specifically for the harp writing, but are so tightly woven together in the concept of the piece that it feels so much like just he's constructing a body that all of these sounds are coming from, which are really, it's a really interesting way of tying together sort of the technical aspect and the natural aspect, I think.
I think Igor is also great to work with too. And I find that he's a composer. He really knows what he wants, and he has a specific sound in his mind he's trying to achieve. But at the same time, he's very open-minded. If certain things that technically doesn't work out for the instrument well, and he is willing to make adjustments. And I think that having that flexibility really make the performers feel very comfortable working with him.
To say we have what I would consider a kind of ideal working relationship with him, in the sense that we can look back to the past and draw upon this large body of experience, many different styles, and get a real sense of him as, of course, as a friend, as an individual, but also just to get a sense of how his writing has evolved over the years. And I find it amazing how different all of his pieces are from one another, yet you can find certain threads that tie his music together. Even looking at his scores, there's a sense of familiarity because he uses the same kind of font. It's a certain way of displaying the score that it kind of feels, it's very much him, and it feels like, oh yeah, this is from our old friend, right? So there's that familiarity, even though it's a completely different language.
So moving on with the program that and the composers featured in this program, I was curious to know about you select 3 composers, women composers, Tania León, Hilda Paredes, and Slim Noor. And I was curious, Ben, to know the creation process. And it's not very common to see women composers, especially Latin American composers, featuring one single program. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about these women composers and how you became engaged with them for this program.
I can say a couple of things if you'd like.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so. One thing I would say, one thing that Del Niente likes to do is form close collaborations with artists that we're drawn to for some reason. In fact, our 1920 season, the theme of our season last year was fellow travelers, and we kind of had this sense that there are composers that for some reason we feel some affinity to, and somewhere along their journey we encounter them and travel with them for a while. And I think certainly Igor is one of those people. Tomas Gueglio is one of those people. And I would say recently, both Tania León and Hilda Paredes have been just composers that for whatever reason we've taken an interest in. And it's hard to say really why that is. I mean, I think in the case of Tania León, a few of us worked with her in Chicago in 2019 with the Grossman Ensemble. And working with her, one gets a sense of her extraordinary musicianship, her extraordinary personal warmth, and her really unique artistry. I mean, this is a person that really it has an encyclopedic knowledge of Latin American popular musics, and she manages to incorporate these into her works. And I know as a conductor working with her, I was just really drawn to just both the brilliance of her thought and the extraordinary nature of her musicianship. So I think we're sort of maybe at the beginning of our engagement with her. With a person like Hilda Paredes, we actually met her in Mexico. I would say a lot of the stuff on this program has to do with the ensemble's experiences in Mexico, where we have a number of friends and collaborators. A great friend of ours is Jose Julio Diaz Infante, who curates an extraordinary festival in Mexico City, the Forum of New Music, I suppose you'd say in English. It's an extraordinary 3-week-long festival that happens every year in Mexico City, and we played there in 2018, where we met Hilda Paredes for the first time, and we just found her to be an extraordinary person, and it just felt like a thing we wanted to do. We wanted to collaborate with her, and she's been a guest at our composition program. Noor Slim is a young composer, and I encountered her actually sort of by chance. I was I went to a concert in Mexico City a number of years ago, and I saw this piece performed by the incredible ensemble there called Cepro Music, which is the state-funded new music ensemble in Mexico City. And Noor Slim, she was a student of that ensemble's conductor, Jose Luis Castillo. And this was her very first large ensemble work, and it's just an extraordinary piece. And so I think, we've encountered all these composers in a lot of different ways, but I think we like to think of ourselves as at various points in our relationships with these composers, and we expect them to be long and fruitful relationships.
Now, that's great. It's interesting because Jose Luis Castillo, he's also the composer of one of the pieces from Tambuco that we are presenting on October 30th. So that's interesting to see the connection there. And I was also interested in Noor Slim in this piece. I was learning about her and her work. Seems like also her line of work is also very distant from what would you say are the line of work in the other composer from Dal Niente. I thought that she has a lot of children music. So I was interested if you can tell a little bit more about the connection between you and her work.
I think as my sense of her is just that she's has if we feel some affinity with her, it probably is that she has so much different kinds of work that she does, and she also has, she has albums of sort of really non-classical music. I don't know what if you'd characterize it as pop or jazz or what, but I think that the breadth of her work for such a young person is a thing that I really admire, and I think that Dal Niente probably feels some affinity with, because we also consider ourselves to work in a lot of different areas. We don't like to just confine ourselves to something called contemporary classical music or new music or whatever. We like to really work in a lot of different areas. We like to improvise. We like to commission composers. We like to do devised works. We like to do sometimes works that have theatrical elements. We've done a bunch of staged works as well. So I think we just find ourselves drawn to people that, like us, have a broad range of interests and aesthetic styles and tastes. And those are the kind of people we like to hang out with. I'm not sure. That's probably the best answer I could think to give. And I think I do want to say that it's just, sometimes it's great to notice. Sometimes the connections that we develop with composers are very well curated and intentional, and we go about doing it very intentionally. And sometimes, things happen at random. And I'm really grateful that I happened to attend this concert by Cepro Music, where they played this extraordinary piece. And it's nice occasionally when just the world does something like that to you, where the universe decides to create this connection that has hopefully unknown implications for the future.
I was wondering if you could speak, perhaps Michael, a bit more about Noor Slim's piece, because this is an interesting one in many ways, partly because of there's kind of this interesting role of silences and interruptions, and the types of interruptions. One that particularly stuck out was when somebody answers their bassoon. or as a sort of we'll leave it to you to watch to see what I mean by that. But there's a kind of an approach to the flow of the music that's really intriguing, and I'm just wondering, is that one of the things that might have drawn you to it, or just one of many? I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think like I'm also fascinated by composers that sort of rethink what ensembles do and what performing means. You know, I mean, I think like one sort of sometimes has a stereotype of new music ensembles as very serious people wearing all black or turtlenecks or something like that. You know, at least that's what, when I was in college, everyone wore turtlenecks. I think it was that's what the late 90s were like. And I really think that there's a line of composers who, maybe a tradition of composers in sort of late 20th century, who really notice that you know, a performance is a performance. It's real people on a stage, and performances, whether intentional or not, always have some sense of theatrics about them. And I think, you know, a composer like Mauricio Kagel really emphasizes the theatrical nature of, you know, he's a much older composer. It emphasizes the theatrical nature of music performance, but then there's a sort of line of composers after him who, in various kinds of ways, thematize the actual artificial construction of the performance. And I found Nur's piece to be kind of, you know, simultaneously like weird and funny, you know, and she sort of like reconstructs the ensembles where there's, you know, these duets and different sort of, you know, people collaborating at different periods of time, or in different movements. And of course there are the full ensemble movements, and there's the singer. And I really appreciated her particular, you know, very unique combination of like very well constructed, you know, very serious but also very humorous way of approaching the theatrics of an ensemble, that I think is pretty, you know, unique. I mean, different composers do it different ways. You know, people that work in the so-called new discipline have different ways of approaching theatrics, and I found hers just utterly charming and unique.
That's fantastic. Well, speaking of the voice, Harry, I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to, you've got a wide variety of pieces that you'll be singing, and kind of very different. One of which I have not heard, because I think this will be the premiere, at least at Tomas's piece. But you're probably, I imagine, asked to do a lot of different things with different goals in each work. You know, some of which are, you know, have a kind of a linear melodic component, others that are more pointillistic or more atmospheric. I'm wondering if you could just maybe speak about the works that you're participating in, and your experiences with learning them and performing them.
Sure. Well, I'll say that this is kind of representative of the types of things that I'm used to doing with Dal Niente. It's really more, I'm being treated like an instrument all the time. And I guess the distinction between normally being treated as a vocalist versus being treated as an instrument is that the variety of colors and textures that I'm being asked to produce is much broader than it would be if I was just being written a lovely art song with a, you know, typical melody with perfect, you know, text setting, and, you know, within the area of the voice that people like to listen to, as in not way above the staff a lot or not way below the staff a lot. And yeah, so I'm you know, doing a lot of the things that I normally get asked to do for Dal Niente. And I guess with Tomas's piece, he is creating this he's creating this frame in which I'm sort of playing the role of an old movie sound. So he has this, I'll let you read the notes because I don't want to spoil it, but it's this, he's trying to evoke old classic movie expression. And that includes sort of the filtering of the way that the sound was recorded in the 40s. So there are a lot of extended technique moments where I'm filtering my face or making sounds that reduce the partials in such a way that it sounds a little bit like what happens to sounds in movies from that period. And for Noor's piece, I mean, God, Noor's piece is definitely a decathlon of sounds. It's continually changing. And what I really, really love about the piece is that the notation is constantly changing as well. She has some pieces that are just, you know, very normative notation. I do the things that are written on the page, and everyone, you know, if another soprano looked at that page, they would probably sound pretty much the same. But she also has movements where she's making, she does kind of cartoon pictures, sort of like Kathy Berberian's Strip City, where, you know, there's a picture of a cloud blowing air. And I completely love that because it stimulates me to use my body completely differently. You know, when I'm looking at a note and I'm looking at a staff and I'm thinking about the pitch, my body is behaving like a thoroughbred. I'm doing this thing. All of my muscles are, you know, coordinating to execute specific instructions. And when I see those cartoons, I feel like my grandma is reading me a story, and she is, you know, she's trying to create this little movie in the room for me, you know, with just her voice and maybe a couple pictures. And that makes me react differently. So I really enjoy that. She's incredibly creative. And also I think she has a lot of respect for the physicality of being a performer. You know, I think that it's very easy when you're trying. I'm sorry?
Does she sing as well, I think?
She's a guitarist, but she might sing.
Yeah.
We all sing. Yeah, so I think I'm sure that to some extent she gets this from having been trained as a jazz guitarist, that she understands that sometimes you can just light a match and let the thing go and something energetic and musical will happen that you will be happy about. And I really appreciate that about the piece.
Well, we're looking forward to you know, hearing your version of it for sure. One other question about Tomas's piece, just again, I just tried to look into it, not knowing exactly what it's going to be. But is there a tango component to it, or does that come through, or no?
You know, I would say perhaps. I mean, yeah, I think perhaps so. Like, I think that there's definitely. I think it's easy to hear tango when you think about the 40s. Actually, there's something like kind of romantical and you know, I don't know, dance film about the way that he wrote. So I definitely think you could pick that up.
Well, I wonder if we could go back. First of all, thank you, Carrie, for that. I wonder if we could go back to Hilda Paredes' work for harp and ensemble. And Ben, it would be great to hear you speak about this work. I mean, I've always loved her music and listened to a lot of it. This piece to me is a very delicate one. Like, there's a lot of, and I think, you know, one always gets afraid of overwhelming a harp. You probably feel differently about that. You say there's nothing that can overwhelm, you know, the harp. But maybe you could speak a bit about your experience with the piece and how the instrument fits with the ensemble, because it does feel like this sort of meta instrument at times.
Before Ben does that, I'm going to jump in and say that Ben is the loudest harp player I have ever met. So yeah, it is certainly true that I'm often concerned about balance in terms of the harp, but Ben, even sometimes when he's playing with a full orchestra that I'm conducting, I often have to tell him to shut up. So I'm not too worried about him getting overwhelmed, but Ben, please go on.
Well, thanks. I mean, this is a really fascinating piece for a lot of reasons. So certainly in the harp repertoire, it's kind of unusual for a harp concerto to actually have like the full complement of the orchestra. There are a few pieces that have that, certainly newer ones. And Hilda's piece is like, you know, a sinfonietta kind of like extended chamber music size piece with I think maybe 15 or 16 players. So it's a full wind section, 2 percussion, of course strings, and then harp. But it's not like a ton of people, which is really an interesting, kind of ensemble, because you have enough body there to evoke a larger ensemble, but also enough kind of agility and not so much to theoretically overpower the harp. Okay, so that said, I had a really wonderful conversation with her just a couple days ago. The piece is called Demente Cuerda, which kind of means like 2 things that are sort of opposite. It's a little bit of a play on words. So the literal translation is twisted path or twisted string. And the more sort of connotation is that it means of sound mind. And so she said it kind of encompasses a broad range of things, or sort of a tension between 2 poles where you can kind of fit the music in however you feel like, or whatever your interpretation is. So my interpretation of the piece, and one of the things that I love so much about it, is how much sort of different types of harp writing she kind of weaves together into the one piece itself. So and there are times when the harp is really sort of contributes to like a texture, where you have the harp doing things that you might expect in like an orchestra kind of a thing, where you have high notes that are sort of complemented with other parts of the ensemble. She does cool things with bendy notes, which is not a thing the harp usually does, with bendy string notes, which is great, sort of echoing among sort of the cellos and the basses. And at other times you have music that's really very soloistic. I call it sort of rhapsodic. That's a little bit rubato, but it is still kind of snapped into a rhythmic grid, even though that rhythmic grid is a little bit kind of asymmetric. And then she has this really great thing that I described as sort of like melodies snaking up and down the instrument. And she said it was kind of an angular melody, which I think is exactly what's there, where you have this melody that is sort of contributed to by different dimensions within the instrument. So different sort of registers, certainly different types of sounds, and different ways of transforming the pitch kind of after or once you pluck it. So the harp writing is really a huge range, which I think is really fascinating for such a relatively short piece. I think it's 15 or 16 minutes, and it's a concerto. It's very hard. And I think it's really just a tremendous piece that doesn't get a lot of performances. I think this will be the 4th performance. That's probably worth researching. I believe the first was in Spain, where it was commissioned, and then there have been 2 student performances that I know of, McGill and then Juilliard. And we're just really looking forward to it. I mean, one of the things, David, that you asked earlier is just about sort of general curation. And one of the things that I think we factor pretty heavily into our curation is also these pieces that are for sort of 16 players that Del Niente can really do, that are maybe too small or too weird for like a big orchestra, but also too big for a small new music ensemble. And so that's one of the areas where I think Del Niente really excels. And certainly this piece and Nur's piece, and I think also to an extent the other pieces on the program really energize the fact that Del Niente is highly configurable, and we can emphasize and feature all the different players and instruments of the ensemble in a way that is really unique. You come to a Del Niente show and you'll see a duet, and you'll see a wind quintet, and then you'll see a sinfonietta-sized concerto for the harp, and then you'll see like a multi-movement piece featuring soprano and 5 or 6 other instruments that range from like, sometimes when we're having programming meetings, we'd say, pieces are like notes and rhythms, right? Notes and rhythms on one side. And then that's like, Hilda's piece is notes and rhythms. And then on the other side, you have semi-determinate, indeterminate, non-notated, semi-notated music, which is another area that we really do. And so we have pieces that really are, we have a program that is really embraces the pluralism of the kind of music that Del Niente plays, and I think the kind of music Del Niente reflects in its environment both its kind of local community as well as maybe a broader community that might be geographically further away, but is still like very close. Hilda stayed in the same hotel that we stayed in Mexico. I mean, these are all folks that are 1 or 2 degrees of separation from us. And so it's so easy for us to engage in that kind of in a conversation with people from all over the world. That's, so you asked about HARP, and now I started talking about curation and how we're all friends. So there we go.
No, that's great.
And question. Quick follow-up question on your experience with this piece. Did you have a chance to consult with Hilda as you went along? Did you have how was the process of this piece?
Yeah, I think, well, with Hilda, we have sort of developed our relationship over the months. So it was right 2018 when we were in Mexico, and then we just kind of started talking with her. And so for this piece in particular, we've sent a bunch of emails. I sent her recordings. We would have a couple of Zoom meetings here and there to kind of fine tune little things here about this and that. The music is very well notated, so there aren't a ton of questions that arose that I had. But we, used kind of like traditional virtual means to have our conversation.
One other thing that you said that was, kind of struck me across, going from kind of the very specific notation and clarity that's in Hilda's piece to some of the other ones that that have less specific notation or give a certain degree of player choice involved. There's still this sort of soundscape feel. If you look at like the Amaya piece, if I'm pronouncing it, there's like this extremely haunting feel to it that I found the same thing with Hilda's, and I'm using very basic words for extremely complex and very different pieces, but there's this sort of ethos with all of them, and it's interesting that people are able to accomplish those types of soundscapes and sound worlds via such different means, sometimes being hyper specific and sometimes ceding some of that control to the performer. I know that that's something that happens in Igor's piece too at the beginning, but I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but except to say that is that something that's kind of one of those things that just kind of comes together in a final program by chance? It seems like that often happens with these new music programs, that the pieces inform each other in ways that are unexpected, and it's always just interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll just start right off. I'm sure all of you guys have answers to that. I think one of the things, like I mentioned, I always come back to just the word pluralistic, because I think that one of the things that Del Niente does really well, or at least we do well when we talk about our programming, our curation, is really embrace the kind of the world that we are in, which is that there are many types of music, there are many influences, there are many ways in which things interact, there are many ways in which you can be a person in the world. And so I think that it's important for Del Niente that we program pieces that reflect that. That, in Del Niente's very, very early days, I think we were perhaps more focused on playing a lot of European composers. And I think that we have sort of shifted away from that in the past few seasons, maybe 5 or 6 seasons, to really be thinking about what kind of a community we're in, what kinds of music interact all in the same kind of space, and where does that music come from, who writes that music, and what types of, let me see, how am I trying to say? I think we're very interested in like exposing the ways in which music has gotten the kind of baggage, classical music has gotten the kind of baggage that it currently has. And we're interested in kind of overturning that and rethinking about, what does it mean to kind of play music, be a musician, listen to music, consume music, when we have, in our hometown of Chicago, all the different kinds of ways of being right here. So I think it's important for us to also, as an ensemble, just reflect to the best that we can, of course, with the skills that we have, reflect that environment.
Yeah, and maybe if you'd like, I could follow up with supporting thoughts to what Ben, I think, just so excellently said. I would say an influence on our programming, and I think that applies to the curation of this concert as well, is our great friend George Lewis, who talks about creolization. He has this. He talks about creolité is the French word that he quotes. Where he has this notion that what is happening in new music and what ought to be happening in new music is a kind of creolization of styles. That we're all, in a sense, kind of musical creoles. There's no sort of single. There's not a pure tradition. There's only different people being influenced and being influenced in a lot of different ways. And I think you really do see that in this program, where you've got, a composer like Hilda Paredes, who of course is Mexican and has Mayan ancestry, and who lives in London, and you've got Luis Fernando Amaya, who is from Mexico, but lived in Chicago for a number of years, studied in Chicago for a number of years. And then you've got Igor Santos, who is, half Brazilian, half Japanese, I think, is that right? And, is from Cleveland or something like that. And, so it's just this totally unlikely kind of mix of influences and backgrounds. And I think we really embrace that. And I think, and you essentially see that in Latin American new music. I mean, I think that certainly one thing we want to do very explicitly, I think, is create more connection between Latin American new music scenes and U.S. new music scenes. The U.S. has an extraordinary, diverse set of new musics, but Latin America does as well. And I think we tend to know the Latin American composers that live in the U.S., but there's so many more, and they're just all working in like totally different fields and doing totally different things. And I think if one thing we can accomplish with this concert is to sort of be the tip of an iceberg, I think we will have been very happy.
I think both of you spoke very eloquently about those things. Thank you. Another piece on the program that we haven't discussed yet is kind of the classic work, because it's from, I think, 2000, is it? Tania León's De Memorias, and it's a wind quintet. And I'd be curious to learn more about what drew you to this particular work as a fit for the program.
I mean, I think, I think the reason this particular work is on the program, I'd say, I mean, the instrumentation happens to work really well for this program, and I think that I think the thing about her is simply that we love her music, and I can just say personally, I'm just looking for another excuse to work with her, and I think that maybe the particular thing that I'm drawn to about her music is that again is this kind of like notion of creolization, is that she has such an encyclopedic knowledge of not sort of Latin American non-classical music styles, and she really like weaves these seamlessly into pieces that are also like very heavy, carefully constructed sort of classical music compositions. And so she sort of creates this very, I think, totally unique and hybrid style where it's like, is it classical music or what is the status of this music or something like that? I think that's also a thing that we really like, is people that sort of question, where you have a hard time actually pinning down a style, and people that really create kind of sui generis musics. I mean, there's just no one else that writes like Tania León. And her music is such an expression of who she is, this extraordinary pianist, like an amazing musician. I mean, I rehearsing with her with the Grossman Ensemble, it's like she's one of those composers that can do everything. So like she, you know, we weren't doing the groove right, so she like sat down at the piano and started improvising and started like, you know, playing all the harmonies from the piece. And then she came over to me and she was like, no, don't conduct like that. And she tried to teach me how to conduct, you know. So she's just one of those people that like she can do she's like Lachenmann or something, where Lachenmann can make all the sounds that he wants, you know. And so I think I'm just personally really taken with someone that can virtuosically perform what they do. And I think all of her music is just such an expression of her personality and her sort of musical being. So, and I just find that really irresistible.
Well, that's I really enjoy hearing that, and just reminds me that about the conversation we had with Tambuco last week, and they also mentioned exactly what you just did about the need to look to Latin America, about these wonderful composers and all this bubbling that is happening there.
Yeah.
Because as we go, we see so much about Europe. We see all these great composers and all this history, which is great, it's fantastic. But we also have the need to tell and see what's going on in other parts of the world. That is fascinating. And I can see that very clearly in Dal Niente's history, not just now, but throughout the history, the need to look for new sounds, new music perspective that you can find in different parts of the world. As we are humans and we react to our environment, that has a different taste. And I can see that clearly in Dal Niente. And I really appreciate that. I think brings so much to the community in general. We appreciate having that different flavors in the music. So as we wrap this up, I would like to hear more about the next projects. What's bubbling in Dal Nientes? What's coming up?
I'll say a couple of things, and then I would also like to hear from everybody else, of course. So in the short term, you know, we're trying to figure out ways to be a new music ensemble in the middle of a pandemic. So it means, you know, investing in plexiglass screens and lots of masks and figuring out ways that we can be responsible and be apart from each other by at least 6 or 9 feet in a rehearsal. So we have some very practical issues that we have to address to, you know, get through, we hope, you know, this season. A lot of course, last season was a little bit put on hold. So we're still looking forward to doing some of those projects, one of which is a new piece by Roscoe Mitchell for Dal Niente and saxophone soloist Ken Vandermark. We've got a couple of other new pieces coming up. We've got, we're looking to bring South African composer Andile Khumalo to Chicago at the end of this year, if things are okay by then, at the end of the season. We've got a new piece by Alec Hall. We've got a commission by Carola Bockholt that we're very excited about. What else? We're going to continue with our summer residency for new music. Yeah, we always looking for, you know, playing around the country and playing in different parts. We've got a residency, actually, Carrie's new place where she's working at with the University of Washington coming up. And actually, a really great thing is we just did our first taping, our first virtual concert 2 days ago in the same hall that this concert will be in, where we recorded Gerard Griset's Vortex Temporum, a piece by Melissa Vargas. She's from Mexico, another composer.
She's Colombian.
Excuse me, sorry. A piece by Anthony Green, and then a piece by Rebecca Saunders, which will be broadcast in, I think, probably a couple weeks. Yeah, that's kind of what's next up.
Well, that's great. We really appreciate having you talk to us this morning, and we're looking forward to November 13th, the premiere of Dal Niente's ensemble performance. So thank you so much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.